The lightning split the sky like a jagged knife, and through the sheets of rain that turned the Wyoming plains into a churning sea of mud, James Callahan spotted something that made his heart lurch. A figure collapsed beside the old oak tree, barely visible through the deluge that had transformed the summer evening of 1878 into a torrential nightmare. He spurred his horse forward, the animal protesting against the wind that whipped across the open range with furious intent. As he drew closer, James could see it was a woman, her dark hair plastered against her face, her dress soaked through until it clung to her like a second skin. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered loud enough for him to hear over the roar of the storm. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her eyes were barely open, unfocused and glassy with the early stages of shock. "Ma'am," he shouted over the thunder, swinging down from his saddle and landing with a splash in the ankle-deep water that rushed across the ground. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She tried to speak, but only a faint whimper escaped her lips. Her fingers were curled into the muddy earth as though she had been trying to crawl somewhere, anywhere, before her strength had finally given out. James did not hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, startled by how light she felt, how fragile and how cold her skin was even through the layers of wet fabric. She barely stirred as he lifted her, her head lolling against his chest. His cabin was only a quarter-mile away, but it felt like 10 as he carried her through the storm, leading his horse with one hand while cradling her against him with the other. The rain pelted them mercilessly, and the wind tried to tear them both from the path, but James had weathered worse storms in his 30 years on this earth. He had survived the war, survived the hard years that followed, and he would not let this woman perish on his land. The cabin appeared through the gray curtain of rain like a beacon of hope. James kicked the door open and stumbled inside, water streaming from both of them onto the wooden floor. He carried her straight to the fireplace, where embers from the morning still glowed faintly in the hearth. Setting her down gently in his only chair, he worked quickly to rebuild the fire, feeding it kindling and logs until flames leaped up, casting warm golden light across the small room. Only then did he get a proper look at her. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 23 or 24, with delicate features and skin that would have been fair if not for the deathly pallor that had settled over it. Her dress, though ruined by the storm, had once been fine, the kind of garment a woman of means would wear. What was someone like her doing out on the open plains in the middle of a storm? "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, though he was not sure she could even hear him. Her eyes had closed and her breathing was shallow and rapid. James grabbed every blanket he owned from his bed and the trunk in the corner, then hesitated. Propriety warred with necessity, but necessity won. He could not let her freeze to death out of some misguided sense of decorum. As gently as he could, he removed her sodden dress and the layers beneath, averting his eyes as much as possible while ensuring she was dry. He wrapped her in the blankets until she looked like a cocoon, then positioned her closer to the fire. He removed his own soaking shirt and grabbed a dry one from his trunk, then set about making coffee and heating water. For an hour he tended to her, watching anxiously for any signs of improvement. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, color began to return to her cheeks. Her shivering lessened, and her breathing steadied. James sat on the floor beside her chair, relief flooding through him as he realized she was going to be all right. It was nearly dark when her eyes finally opened. They were brown, he noticed, a deep, rich brown like polished walnut, and they were filled with confusion as they focused on him. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "My cabin, about 15 miles south of Laramie," James said, keeping his voice gentle. "I found you out in the storm. You were in bad shape, ma'am. What happened to you?" She closed her eyes again, and for a moment he thought she had fallen back into unconsciousness. But then she spoke, her words coming slowly as though each one required great effort. "My wagon. There was an accident. The storm spooked the horses and they bolted. I was thrown clear, but the wagon went over. My uncle, he was driving. I tried to reach him, but—" her voice broke. "The wagon was on top of him. I tried to lift it, but I could not. I tried for so long, but I could not move it." "Your uncle," James said quietly. "Is he still out there?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I should have stayed with him, but I could not bear it. I thought perhaps I could find help, but I just kept walking, and then I could not walk anymore." James felt his chest tighten with sympathy. "How long ago did this happen?" "This morning, I think, or maybe yesterday. I do not know any more." If it had been that long, there was no hope for the man, but James kept that thought to himself. "What is your name, ma'am?" "Catherine." "Catherine Winters. We were traveling from Cheyenne to my uncle's homestead near Laramie. He was all the family I had left." Fresh tears spilled over, and she turned her face away from him. James reached out hesitantly, then gently touched her shoulder through the blankets. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Winters. Truly sorry. But you are safe now, and once this storm passes, we will go look for your uncle. We will do right by him, I promise you that." She nodded, unable to speak past the grief that choked her. James rose and ladled some hot broth into a tin cup, the result of the rabbit stew he had made the day before. "You need to drink this," he said, kneeling beside her. "You need to get your strength back." Catherine took the cup with trembling hands and sipped slowly. The warmth of the broth seemed to revive her somewhat, and she managed to drink half of it before exhaustion claimed her again. James caught the cup before it could fall, then adjusted the blankets around her and let her sleep. The storm raged through the night, but inside the cabin, all was warm and quiet except for the crackle of the fire and Catherine's steady breathing. James dozed in a chair across from her, waking periodically to add wood to the fire and check on his unexpected guest. Each time he looked at her, he felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt in a very long time. Protectiveness, certainly, but something more than that. Something that made him want to smooth the damp hair back from her forehead, to promise her that everything would be all right even though he had no right to make such promises. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. Catherine woke as light streamed through the cabin's single window. She sat up slowly, the blankets falling away slightly, and James quickly looked away until she had them secured around herself again. "Your dress is dry," he said, gesturing to where he had hung it near the fire. "It is not in great shape, but it will do until we can get you proper clothes." "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life, mister. I am sorry, I do not even know your name." "James Callahan," he said, "and you do not owe me thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." "I am not sure that is true," Catherine said, and there was a sadness in her voice that suggested she had learned some hard lessons about human nature. "But regardless, I am grateful." James busied himself making coffee and frying up some salt pork and cornbread, while Catherine dressed behind the blanket he had strung up to give her privacy. When she emerged, she looked more herself, though her eyes were still shadowed with grief, and her movements were stiff and careful. They ate in silence for a while, and then Catherine spoke. "You said we would look for my uncle. Do you truly mean that?" "I do. I will saddle my horse and we will ride out. Can you tell me which direction you came from?" She nodded. "East, I think, though I was not thinking clearly." "I just walked and walked. We will find the place," James assured her. "The storm will have left signs." They set out an hour later, Catherine riding behind James on his sturdy bay gelding. She held onto his waist tentatively at first, but as the horse picked its way across the rain-soaked terrain, she gripped him more tightly. James tried not to think about the feel of her pressed against his back, the way her breath warmed his shoulder blade through his shirt. They found the wagon 2 miles from his cabin, or what was left of it. The vehicle was overturned, half submerged in a newly formed gully where rainwater had carved a deep channel into the earth. One wheel was completely smashed, and the canvas top was torn to shreds. And there, pinned beneath the wagon's frame, was the body of an older man, his face peaceful despite the violence of his death. Catherine made a sound like a wounded animal and would have slid from the horse if James had not caught her. He dismounted first, then helped her down, keeping a steadying arm around her waist as she approached her uncle's body. "Thomas Winters," she whispered. "He was a good man. He took me in when my parents died of fever 3 years ago. He never made me feel like a burden, even though I know I was. He was going to set up a new life in Wyoming, and he wanted me to come with him to have a fresh start." "He loved you," James said quietly. "I can tell from the way you speak of him." Together, they worked to free Thomas's body from beneath the wagon. It was grim, difficult work, made harder by the mud and the weight of the vehicle, but eventually they succeeded. James fashioned a travois from branches and rope, and they carried Thomas's body back to the cabin. Over the next 2 days, James built a coffin from planks he had been saving to expand his cabin, and Catherine sewed a shroud from one of her uncle's shirts that she retrieved from the scattered remains of their belongings. They buried Thomas Winters on a hill overlooking James's property, where wildflowers grew thick in the summer, and the view stretched out forever across the rolling plains. Catherine stood over the grave long after James had finished saying a few words from the Bible his mother had given him before she died. The wind lifted her dark hair, and in the golden afternoon light, she looked like a figure from a painting, beautiful and tragic and utterly alone. "What will you do now?" James asked when she finally turned away from the grave. "I do not know," she admitted. "My uncle's homestead, it was not yet built. He had only filed the claim. There is nothing there but empty land, and I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." "You could stay here," James heard himself say before he had fully thought it through. "At least until you figure out what you want to do. I know it is not proper, but I could build a partition in the cabin, give you your own space. And I am gone most days checking the herd and mending fences. You would hardly see me." Catherine looked at him with those deep brown eyes, and James saw the war waging within her, pride against necessity, propriety against survival. "I cannot impose on you like that," she said finally. "You have already done so much." "It is not an imposition," James said, and he meant it. In the 2 days since he had carried her in from the storm, the cabin had felt different, less lonely. "I have the space, and you need somewhere to be while you grieve and make plans. It is settled if you will have it." She studied him for a long moment, as though trying to determine his motives. James met her gaze steadily, letting her see that he meant no harm, that he offered only shelter and kindness. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "Just for a little while," she said. "Until I can figure out what to do next, and I will earn my keep. I can cook and clean and mend. I will not be a burden." "You could never be a burden," James said, and the truth of those words surprised him. So Catherine Winters stayed in James Callahan's cabin on the Wyoming plains, and slowly, day by day, she began to heal. She took over the cooking, transforming James's simple meals of beans and salt pork into dishes that actually had flavor and variety. She mended his clothes, which had been held together by increasingly desperate stitching. She swept and organized, and gradually the cabin began to feel like a home rather than just a place where a lonely cowboy slept between long days of work. James found himself looking forward to returning each evening, to seeing the lamp burning in the window and knowing Catherine would be there. They fell into an easy rhythm, talking over supper about small things at first, the weather, the cattle, the gossip from when James rode into Laramie for supplies. But as the weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Catherine told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her parents who had dreamed of a better life out west but had died before seeing those dreams realized. She spoke of her education, uncommon for a woman of her time, and her love of books and learning. James, in turn, shared things he had not spoken of in years. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done that still haunted his dreams. He spoke of his parents, both gone now, and the sister he had lost to childbirth. He told her about his dream of building a real ranch, of having a spread large enough to hire hands and make a proper living instead of just scraping by. "You will do it," Catherine said one evening as they sat outside watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I can tell you are the kind of man who does not give up on his dreams." "Sometimes I wonder," James admitted. "It gets lonely out here, working all day with no one to talk to, coming back to an empty cabin at night, makes a man question whether it is all worth it." "But not empty anymore," Catherine said softly, and when James turned to look at her, he found her already watching him. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what was growing between them, fragile and new but undeniably real. James cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. "No," he agreed. "Not empty anymore." The first kiss happened 3 weeks after Catherine had come into his life. They were in the cabin, working together to move his bed so she could have a properly private sleeping area. Catherine stepped backward at the same moment James moved forward and they collided. He caught her instinctively, his hands on her waist, and she braced herself against his chest. They froze like that, close enough that James could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough. "Yes," she whispered. He should have stepped back, should have apologized and put proper distance between them. Instead, he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. Her eyes fluttered closed, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and absolutely perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Catherine smiled up at him. "I was beginning to think you never would," she said. "I did not want to presume," James said. "You have been through so much, and you are here because you had nowhere else to go. I never wanted you to feel obligated or—" She stopped his words with another kiss, this one more confident, more insistent. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. "James Callahan, I am here because this is where I want to be, with you. I think I have known it for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything, afraid you might not feel the same way." "I feel the same way," James said, cupping her face in his hands. "I have fallen in love with you, Catherine Winters. I know it is fast, and I know the circumstances are unusual, but I cannot deny what my heart is telling me." "Then do not deny it," Catherine said, "because I have fallen in love with you too." They stood there holding each other as the evening light faded from the window, and James felt something in his chest that he had not felt in years, pure, uncomplicated happiness. But happiness in the Wild West was never uncomplicated for long. A week after their first kiss, James rode into Laramie for supplies and returned with troubling news. He found Catherine in the garden she had planted behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn Wyoming soil. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, and Catherine looked up at him with immediate concern. "What is it?" "I was talking to the sheriff in town. He mentioned that a man has been around asking questions about Thomas Winters. About whether he had any family, whether anyone had come to claim his homestead." Catherine went very still, her hand frozen in the act of pulling a weed. "What kind of man?" "Lawyer type, from what the sheriff said, name of Harrison Burke. Do you know him?" Catherine's face had gone pale. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know him. He was my uncle's business partner back in Ohio. They had a falling out years ago, something about money that went missing from their joint accounts. My uncle always believed Burke stole it, but he could never prove it. That is part of why he decided to come west, to start fresh away from all of that." "Well, Burke is here now," James said, "and according to the sheriff, he is claiming that your uncle owed him money, a substantial amount. He says if there are any heirs, they are liable for the debt." "That is absurd," Catherine said, her shock giving way to anger. "My uncle owed him nothing. If anything, it was the other way around." "Can you prove it?" James asked gently. Catherine's face fell. "No, all of my uncle's papers, his records, they were in the wagon. They are gone now, destroyed by the storm or scattered across the plains. I have nothing." James knelt beside her and took her hands in his. "Then we will figure this out together. I will not let this man take advantage of you or dishonor your uncle's memory, I promise you that." Harrison Burke arrived at the cabin 3 days later, riding up on a fine black horse that had probably cost more than James made in a year. He was a tall man, thin and sharp-featured, with cold blue eyes that assessed everything they landed on. He dismounted with the air of a man used to getting his way. "You must be Miss Winters," he said, doffing his hat to Catherine, who had emerged from the cabin at the sound of his arrival. "I have been looking for you." "Mr. Burke," Catherine said, her voice cool. "I cannot say I am pleased to see you." "No, I expect not," Burke said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "But we have business to discuss, you and I. Your uncle died owing me $1,500. As his sole heir, that debt falls to you." "My uncle owed you nothing," Catherine said sharply. "He told me about what you did, how you stole from him and tried to ruin his reputation when he confronted you about it." "That is a serious accusation," Burke said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Do you have any proof of these claims?" "Do you have proof of yours?" Catherine shot back. Burke reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "As a matter of fact, I do. A promissory note signed by Thomas Winters promising to repay $1,500 plus interest within 5 years. That time has now expired and I am here to collect." Catherine took the document and read it, her face growing paler with each line. "This is a forgery," she said, but her voice wavered. "That is your uncle's signature, is it not?" Burke asked smoothly. "I am sure any judge would recognize it as such. Now I understand you have no ready cash, but your uncle did file a claim for a homestead. That land has value. Sign it over to me and we will call the debt settled." "No," Catherine said firmly, though James could see she was shaking. "I will not sign anything." Burke's expression hardened. "Then I will take you to court, and when I win, as I surely will, you will lose not only the land but everything else you have. Is that really what you want?" "I think you should leave," James said, speaking for the first time. He had been standing back, letting Catherine handle things, but he could not stay silent any longer. Burke turned his cold gaze on James. "And you are, James Callahan. This is my land, and you are not welcome here." "Ah, yes, I heard Miss Winters was staying with a local rancher." "How convenient for her to have found such a generous benefactor so quickly after her uncle's death. Tell me, Mr. Callahan, what exactly is the nature of your relationship with Miss Winters?" James felt his hands curl into fists, but Catherine laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Our relationship is none of your concern, Mr. Burke," she said with icy dignity. "Now please leave. If you wish to pursue this matter, you may contact me through a lawyer." "Oh, I intend to," Burke said, settling his hat back on his head. "You have 2 weeks, Miss Winters. Either sign over the land or I will see you in court, and I assure you, you will not like how that turns out." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Catherine and James standing in tense silence. As soon as he was out of sight, Catherine sagged against James, who wrapped his arms around her. "He forged that note," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know he did. My uncle would never have borrowed money from that man, not after everything that happened between them." "I believe you," James said, "but the question is, how do we prove it?" They spent the evening poring over what few possessions of Thomas's had survived the wagon accident. There were some clothes, a Bible, a pocket watch, and a small leather journal that Catherine had managed to salvage. She opened the journal carefully, running her fingers over her uncle's familiar handwriting. "He kept notes about everything," she said, flipping through pages of entries about cattle prices, weather patterns, and supplies. If only he had written something about Burke. But as they read through the journal together, hope began to fade. There were no references to Burke, no mentions of any debt or loan. Catherine closed the journal with a heavy sigh, blinking back tears of frustration. "We will find another way," James said, though he had no idea what that way might be. That night, as they lay in their separate sleeping areas, maintaining the propriety that James insisted upon even though it was becoming increasingly difficult, Catherine spoke into the darkness. "James, if Burke wins, if he takes the land, I will have nothing, I will have to leave." "You will never have nothing," James said. "You will have me. We will figure this out, Catherine, together." But what if we cannot? What if he wins and I lose everything my uncle worked for? James was quiet for a moment, then said, "There is one way to protect you from Burke. One way to make sure that whatever happens, you are not left with nothing." "What is that? Marry me." The silence that followed was so complete that James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Perhaps he should have waited, should have proposed properly under the stars or with some romantic gesture. But the words had come from his heart, and he could not take them back. "Marry you?" Catherine's voice was small, uncertain. "I know it is sudden," James said, sitting up and moving closer to her. "And I know we have only known each other a short time, but Catherine, I meant what I said. I love you. I want you to stay here, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is your home. Because I am your home. Marry me and everything I have is yours. Burke cannot touch you then. And more than that, we can build a life together. The life I have always dreamed of but never thought I would have." Catherine sat up too, and in the faint light from the dying fire he could see tears on her cheeks. "Are you asking me to marry you just to protect me from Burke?" "No," James said firmly. "I am asking you to marry me because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because every morning when I wake up and see you here, I thank God for that storm that brought you to me. Because when I think about the future, you are in every vision of it. Burke is just another reason in a long list of reasons why you should be my wife." "Yes," Catherine said, her voice breaking on a sob that was half laughter, half tears. "Yes, James Callahan, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, tasting salt and joy in equal measure. They held each other as the fire burned down to embers, making whispered plans for a future that suddenly seemed bright despite the clouds on the horizon. They were married 3 days later in Laramie, with the sheriff and his wife standing as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple blue dress that James had bought her, and he wore his Sunday best, his hair slicked back and his boots polished. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed his bride with such tenderness that the sheriff's wife dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. They returned to the cabin, their cabin now as husband and wife, and that night they truly became one. James was gentle with Catherine, knowing this was new to her, and she responded to him with a passion that took his breath away. They made love by firelight, and afterward Catherine fell asleep in his arms, her head on his chest and her hand over his heart. The next morning James woke to find her watching him, a soft smile on her face. "Good morning, husband," she said. "Good morning, wife," he replied, pulling her close for a kiss. Their happiness was short-lived. A week later, a courier arrived with a summons to appear in court. Harrison Burke was making good on his threat, and the case would be heard in front of Judge Hawkins in Laramie in 2 weeks' time. James and Catherine made the trip into town to consult with a lawyer, a young man named Timothy Marsh who had only recently set up practice in Laramie. He listened to their story, examined the promissory note Burke had produced, and shook his head gravely. "I will be honest with you," Marsh said. "Without evidence that this note is forged, you have an uphill battle. Burke has a document that appears legitimate, bearing your uncle's signature. All you have is your word that he would not have signed such a thing." "But he would not have," Catherine insisted. "I know my uncle. He despised Burke. He would never have taken money from him." "I believe you," Marsh said kindly, "but belief is not evidence. However, there may be one avenue we can pursue. If we can prove that Burke was not in a position to loan $1,500 at the time this note was supposedly signed, we can cast doubt on the legitimacy of the claim." "How do we do that?" James asked. "We investigate Burke's finances. See if we can find records of his business dealings around that time. If he was struggling financially, it would be unlikely he could have fronted such a large loan." It was a thin thread of hope, but they clung to it. James made inquiries in town, talking to anyone who might have information about Burke. He learned that Burke had arrived in Wyoming about 2 months before, and that he was staying at the nicest hotel in Cheyenne. He had been asking questions about Thomas Winters almost from the moment he arrived, which suggested his interest was not random but deliberate. Catherine, meanwhile, went through her uncle's journal again, this time looking for anything that might be relevant. On the third reading, she found something she had missed before, a brief entry from 4 years earlier that simply read, "Received letter from Burke, still trying to get money. Pathetic." "This proves my uncle knew Burke was struggling financially," Catherine said excitedly, showing James the entry. "Why would he lend money to a man he knew was broke?" "It is a good question," James agreed. "But will it be enough?" They brought the journal to Timothy Marsh, who studied the entry carefully. "This helps," he said. "It establishes that your uncle viewed Burke as someone who needed money, not someone who had it to lend. Combined with any financial records we can dig up on Burke, it might be enough to create reasonable doubt." The night before the trial, James and Catherine lay awake in bed, Catherine's anxiety a palpable presence in the dark room. "What if we lose?" she whispered. "Then we lose the land claim," James said. "But we do not lose each other, and we will find another way to build our future. I have a little money saved. We could buy cattle, expand my herd. It will take longer to build up the ranch, but we will get there." "It is not just about the land," Catherine said. "It is about justice, about not letting Burke get away with dishonoring my uncle's memory." "I know," James said, stroking her hair. "And we will fight as hard as we can, but Catherine, no matter what happens tomorrow, I need you to know something. Meeting you, loving you, marrying you, these are the best things that have ever happened to me. Burke cannot take that away. No one can." Catherine turned in his arms and kissed him fiercely. "I love you, James Callahan. Whatever happens, we face it together." The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the case had spread through Laramie and the surrounding ranches, and people had come to see the drama unfold. Harrison Burke sat at the plaintiff's table with his own lawyer, a slick-looking man from Cheyenne. He nodded at Catherine with a smile that made her skin crawl. Judge Hawkins was a stern man with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He called the court to order and asked Burke's lawyer to present his case. The lawyer stood and laid out Burke's claim in clear, confident terms. He presented the promissory note, had a handwriting expert testify that the signature appeared genuine, and painted a picture of Thomas Winters as a man who had borrowed money to finance his journey west and had died before repaying the debt. When it was their turn, Timothy Marsh called Catherine to the stand. She told her story simply and honestly, describing her uncle's character, his relationship with Burke, and the circumstances that had brought her to Wyoming. Marsh introduced the journal entry as evidence, and Catherine explained what it meant. Under cross-examination, Burke's lawyer tried to shake her testimony, suggesting that she might not have known everything about her uncle's financial dealings, that she was motivated by a desire to keep land that rightfully belonged to Burke. But Catherine held firm, answering each question with quiet dignity. Then Marsh called James to the stand. James testified about finding Catherine, about helping bury her uncle, and about the life they had built together. It was not directly relevant to the case, but Marsh was painting a picture of honest, hardworking people trying to build a future against a predatory claim. Finally, Marsh presented his key evidence, financial records from Ohio that he had managed to obtain through a contact back east. The records showed that 4 years ago, around the time the promissory note was supposedly signed, Harrison Burke had been in serious financial difficulty, with debts of his own and no substantial assets. How could a man who was deeply in debt himself have loaned $1,500? Marsh asked the court. The answer is simple: he could not have. This note is a fabrication created by Mr. Burke in an attempt to steal land that rightfully belongs to Miss Winters, or rather Mrs. Callahan as she now is. Burke's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that old debts did not prove Burke could not have made the loan, that perhaps he had other sources of income not reflected in the records. But James could see that Judge Hawkins was listening carefully, his expression thoughtful. When both sides had rested, the judge announced that he would take the matter under advisement and render a decision within 3 days. It was an agonizing wait. James and Catherine stayed in Laramie, taking a room at a modest boarding house. They spent the time walking through town, trying to distract themselves, but always the case was there in the back of their minds. On the 3rd day, they returned to the courthouse. Judge Hawkins took his seat and looked out over the assembled crowd. His gaze settled on Burke, then on Catherine, and finally on the papers in front of him. "I have considered the evidence and arguments presented by both sides," he began. "This is not an easy case. On its face, the promissory note appears legitimate. However, I am troubled by several factors. First, the financial records presented by the defense suggest that Mr. Burke was in no position to make such a loan at the time in question. Second, the journal entry, while not conclusive, provides contemporary evidence that Thomas Winters viewed Mr. Burke as someone in need of money, not someone with money to lend. Finally, I must consider the timing of this claim. Mr. Burke did not come forward with this supposed debt until after Thomas Winters was dead and could not defend himself or provide his own account of events. Burke's face had gone red, and he leaned over to whisper urgently to his lawyer. Judge Hawkins continued, "While I cannot say with absolute certainty that this promissory note is a forgery, I have sufficient doubt about its authenticity that I cannot in good conscience allow this claim to proceed. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the defendant. The homestead claim filed by Thomas Winters shall pass to his heir, James Callahan, free and clear of any obligation to Harrison Burke." The courtroom erupted in applause and chatter. Catherine burst into tears and James pulled her into his arms, his own eyes stinging. They had won. Justice had prevailed. Burke stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyer hurrying after him, and James felt a fierce satisfaction watching him go. Let him slink back to wherever he came from. He would find no easy prey here. Outside the courthouse, people congratulated them. The sheriff shook James's hand and told him he had done right by Catherine. Timothy Marsh accepted their heartfelt thanks and refused payment beyond a token amount, saying he was just glad to see justice done. As they rode back to the cabin that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in glorious colors, Catherine turned to James and said, "We should build on my uncle's land. Make it the ranch you have always dreamed of. That way his dream and yours can become one." James considered this, then nodded slowly. "Are you certain that land is yours by right? You could do whatever you want with it." "I want to share it with you," Catherine said. "Everything I have, everything I am, I want to share with you. That is what marriage means, is it not?" "Yes," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, it is." Over the following months, they worked tirelessly to build their future. James filed an expanded claim on the land adjacent to Thomas's homestead, creating a substantial spread. They hired a few ranch hands, young men looking to make their way in the West, and began building a proper house on the hill where Thomas was buried. It seemed fitting, somehow, that their home should stand watch over the man who had brought Catherine west, even if he had not lived to see the happiness that journey had ultimately brought her. The house rose slowly, board by board, nail by nail. It was not a grand structure, but it was solid and well-built, with a wide porch and large windows to let in light. Catherine planned every detail, and James built each piece with care, knowing this would be the home where they would raise their family. By the time the house was finished, it was spring of 1879 and Catherine had news to share. She waited until they were sitting on the new porch, watching the sunset over their land before she told him. "James," she said, taking his hand, "I am with child." For a moment, James could not speak. He simply stared at her, joy flooding through him so intensely it was almost painful. Then he pulled her close and held her, this woman who had come into his life like a storm and had transformed everything she touched. "When?" he managed to ask. "Late autumn, the doctor thinks." "October or November." "A baby," James said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Catherine asked, though she was smiling because she could clearly see that he was. "Happy does not begin to cover it," James said. "You have given me everything, Catherine, a home, a purpose, and now a family. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God for you every single day." "You saved my life," Catherine reminded him. "Everything that has happened since flows from that moment when you found me in the storm." "Then that storm was the greatest blessing I have ever received," James said, and kissed her as the sun dipped below the horizon. Catherine's pregnancy progressed smoothly. She continued to work around the ranch, though James fretted constantly and tried to make her rest. She laughed at his worrying and told him she was strong, that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she would be fine. Still, as her belly swelled and the autumn months approached, James found himself praying more than he had in years, asking God to keep both Catherine and the baby safe. In late October, on a clear, cool morning, Catherine woke James with a hand on his shoulder. "It is time," she said calmly. Though he could see the mixture of excitement and fear in her eyes, James scrambled out of bed and rode like the devil to fetch the doctor from Laramie, then the sheriff's wife, who was experienced in midwifery. By the time he returned with both, Catherine's contractions were coming regularly, and she was pacing the house, pausing to breathe through each wave of pain. What followed was the longest day of James's life. He was banished from the bedroom where Catherine labored, left to pace the main room and worry. He could hear her cries through the door, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and tell her she was doing wonderfully. But the doctor and the midwife insisted he would only be in the way. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. James's legs went weak with relief, and he had to sit down before he fell down. A few minutes later, the door opened and the midwife emerged, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully. She is tired but well. You can go in now." James entered the room on shaking legs. Catherine was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but glowing. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. James approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son. The baby had dark hair like Catherine and a red, scrunched-up face that James thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. As he watched, the baby opened his eyes. They were blue, though James knew they might change, and seemed to look right at him. "Hello, little one," James whispered. "I am your father. Do you want to hold him?" Catherine asked softly. James nodded, not trusting his voice. Catherine placed the baby in his arms, and James held his son for the first time, marveling at how small and perfect he was. He had tiny fingers that wrapped around James's large one, and a grip that was surprisingly strong. "What shall we name him?" Catherine asked. James thought for a moment, then said, "Thomas. Thomas James Callahan, after the man who brought you to me." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "My uncle would have loved that," she said. "He would have loved to meet him." "He is watching over him," James said with certainty, "watching over all of us." The years that followed were the happiest of James's life. Young Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. 2 years after Thomas was born, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, and then, 3 years after that, another son they called William. The ranch prospered. The cattle herd grew, and James's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout Wyoming. They hired more hands, including a few young families who settled on the edges of their property, creating a small community. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with rooms added and a larger barn built. Catherine became involved in efforts to bring a school to the area, working with other ranch wives to hire a teacher and build a schoolhouse. She taught her children to read and write before they were old enough to attend, instilling in them the same love of learning that her parents had given her. James often thought back to that storm-drenched night when he had found Catherine collapsed under the oak tree. It seemed like a lifetime ago, yet the memory was vivid. Sometimes, on stormy nights, he would pull Catherine close and thank her for coming into his life, for choosing him, for building this beautiful life together. "I did not choose you," Catherine would always say. "Fate chose us for each other." That storm was not a tragedy. It was destiny bringing us together. The children grew and thrived. Thomas showed an aptitude for ranching that made James proud, but he also had his mother's sharp mind and love of books. Grace was spirited and fearless, more comfortable on horseback than doing needlework, which delighted James and amused Catherine. William was the gentle one, quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for working with animals. As the years passed, James and Catherine added photographs to their walls, images of their growing family, of successful cattle drives, of Christmas gatherings and birthday celebrations. Each photograph told a story, and together they created a tapestry of a life well lived. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Catherine back to the hill where her uncle was buried. They stood together looking out over the land they had built into a thriving ranch, watching their children play in the valley below. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Catherine asked, slipping her hand into his. "After we buried my uncle, I asked you to stay," James said, "and I thought I would stay for just a little while until I figured out what to do with my life." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never imagined that what I would do with my life was this: build a ranch, raise a family, fall more in love with my husband with each passing year." "Are you happy?" James asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Catherine said. "You know, I used to wonder why my parents insisted on coming west, what they hoped to find out here in this wild, hard land. Now I understand. They were looking for this, for freedom, for opportunity, for the chance to build something that was truly theirs. They did not live to see it, but through me, through us, their dream lives on." "And your uncle's dream," James added. "Yes," Catherine agreed. "His most of all." They stood in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the sound of their children's laughter. It was a perfect moment, the kind that James tried to hold on to remember, knowing that these were the moments that made a life meaningful. As the children grew older, they began to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. Thomas, at 15, was nearly as skilled as some of the hired hands, able to rope and brand and handle cattle with confidence. Grace, at 13, had her own horse and could outride most boys her age. William, at 10, had a special way with the animals, able to calm a spooked horse or tend an injured cow with gentle competence. James and Catherine watched their children grow with pride and a touch of wistfulness, knowing that childhood was fleeting and that soon enough they would be facing decisions about their own futures. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, a massive oak table that James had built to accommodate their expanding brood and frequent guests, Thomas made an announcement. "Father, Mother, I have been thinking," he said, suddenly formal in a way that made James and Catherine exchange glances. "I would like to go to college. There is an agricultural college in Colorado that teaches modern ranching techniques and animal husbandry. I think it would help me run this ranch better in the future." James was quiet for a moment, processing this. His immediate instinct was to say no, to keep his son close and teach him everything he needed to know right here. But he looked at Catherine and saw understanding in her eyes. Education had been important to her, and she would want the same opportunities for their children. "That is a big decision," James said finally. "College is expensive and you would be gone for years." "I know," Thomas said, "but I want to be ready to take over the ranch someday." "I want to make you proud." "You already make me proud," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every single day. If this is what you want, then we will find a way to make it happen." Thomas's face lit up with a smile that reminded James so much of Catherine that it made his heart ache. Grace immediately piped up that if Thomas got to go to college, she wanted to go too, and William said he wanted to be a veterinarian, which would also require schooling. "One thing at a time," Catherine said, laughing. But yes, if you want education, we will make sure you get it. That is what parents do. We give our children opportunities we may not have had ourselves. That night, after the children were in bed, James and Catherine sat on their porch wrapped in blankets against the cool autumn air. "Are we doing the right thing?" James asked. "Letting him go?" "Yes," Catherine said without hesitation. "We are not losing him, James. We are giving him wings. And when he comes back, and he will come back, he will be even better equipped to carry on what we have built." "When did you become so wise?" James asked, pulling her closer. "I learned from the best," Catherine said. "From a cowboy who took in a half-drowned stranger and gave her not just shelter, but a life, a purpose, and a love that has sustained me through everything." James kissed the top of her head. "That cowboy was just a lonely man who got incredibly lucky one stormy night." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. Calving in spring, branding in early summer, drives to market in autumn, and quiet winters when the family drew close around the fire. Thomas went off to college and came home for holidays with new ideas and techniques that he and James would discuss late into the night. Grace announced that she wanted to be a teacher like the one who had taught her, and she began helping at the schoolhouse Catherine had helped establish. William got his wish and went to study veterinary medicine, returning to set up a practice that served not just their ranch but all the surrounding spreads. James and Catherine grew older together, their hair graying, their movements perhaps a bit slower, but their love as strong as ever. They became grandparents, first when Thomas married a kind young woman named Sarah, and they had a daughter, then when Grace married a neighboring rancher and had twin boys, and finally when William married and had 3 children in quick succession. The ranch house, already expanded multiple times, had to grow again to accommodate family gatherings. James added on a large room specifically for Christmas and Thanksgiving dinners, with a table that could seat 20 and still feel crowded when all the grandchildren were running around. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. They roasted a whole steer and there was music and dancing late into the night. At one point, Thomas stood up to give a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who built something remarkable not just in terms of land and cattle, but in terms of family and community. My father found my mother in a storm, carried her to safety, and gave her shelter. But what he really gave her was a home. And what they have given all of us is a legacy of love, hard work, and dedication that will carry on for generations." There were tears and laughter as everyone raised their glasses, and James looked around at the faces of his children and grandchildren, at Catherine beside him still beautiful despite the years, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost spiritual. Later, as they danced together under the stars, moving slowly to a fiddle tune played by one of the ranch hands, Catherine said, "Did you ever imagine that night you found me that this is where we would end up?" "No," James admitted. "I imagined you would stay a few weeks, maybe a month, and then move on to whatever life was waiting for you. I never dared to hope you would stay forever." "Forever is not long enough," Catherine said. "I would choose you in every lifetime, James Callahan. In every storm, in every circumstance, I would choose you." They kissed there under the stars, surrounded by the family they had created, the land they had built into something wonderful, and the love that had sustained them through everything. More years passed. James and Catherine stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, turning over control to Thomas while remaining as advisors and beloved grandparents, who always had time for a story or a cookie or a ride around the property. They traveled a bit, taking a trip to San Francisco that Catherine had always dreamed of, and another to see the Rocky Mountains in their full glory. But always, they returned to the ranch, to the home they had built together, to the hill where Thomas Winters was buried and where they could look out over everything they had created. James was 73 when he began to feel his age in earnest. His joints ached, and he moved more slowly, though his mind was still sharp and his love for Catherine undiminished. Catherine was 68, still vibrant but also showing the passage of time. They spent more evenings on the porch, less time riding the range, content to watch the sunset and hold hands and remember. One evening, Catherine said, "James, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," James said, and he meant it. "When my time comes, I want to be buried up on that hill next to my uncle, and I want you there too eventually, so we can all watch over this place together." "That is a morbid topic for such a beautiful evening," James protested. "It is not morbid," Catherine said. "It is practical. We have lived a wonderful life, James. We have loved deeply, raised good children, built something lasting. When the time comes for us to rest, I want to rest knowing we are all together." "Then that is what we will do," James promised, "though I hope that time is very far off still." Catherine smiled and squeezed his hand. "Me too. I am not ready to stop loving you yet." They were granted another 7 years together, 7 years of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. 7 years of sitting on the porch and telling stories about the early days. 7 years of waking up next to each other and being grateful for another day. Catherine passed first, quietly in her sleep on a warm summer night. James woke to find her peaceful beside him, a slight smile on her face, and he knew that she was gone. The grief that hit him was like a physical blow, and he cried for the first time since he was a boy, holding his wife's hand and telling her over and over that he loved her, that she was everything, that he would see her again. They buried her on the hill next to her uncle, with half the county in attendance. Thomas gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears, speaking of his mother's kindness, her strength, her unwavering love for her family. James stood at the graveside, supported by his children, and said his own quiet goodbye. "I will join you soon, my love," he whispered. "Wait for me." He lived another 2 years, cared for by his children and grandchildren who took turns staying with him at the ranch house. He spent his days on the porch, looking out at the land he and Catherine had built together, remembering. He told stories to anyone who would listen, about finding her in the storm, about their wedding, about building the house and raising the children, and all the beautiful ordinary moments that had made up their extraordinary life. On a spring evening, with the wildflowers blooming on the hill where Catherine rested, James Callahan closed his eyes and did not open them again. He passed peacefully, with Thomas holding one hand and Grace holding the other, and William standing nearby. His last word was Catherine. They buried him next to his wife, and the whole family gathered once more. The ranch would continue, passed down through the generations, but it would always be known as the place where a cowboy had found a woman in a storm and had carried her to safety. Where two people who should have been strangers had become everything to each other. Where love had transformed a rough homestead into a legacy that would endure for generations. Thomas stood on the porch of the ranch house after the funeral, looking up at the hill where 3 graves now stood. Thomas Winters, who had brought his niece west seeking a new life. Catherine Callahan, who had found love in the aftermath of tragedy. And James Callahan, the cowboy who had carried her in from the storm and had spent the rest of his life making sure she was warm and safe and loved. "They had a good life," Sarah said, coming to stand beside her husband. "A really good life." "They did," Thomas agreed. "And it all started with a storm and an act of kindness. Father always said that storm was the best thing that ever happened to him." "What will you tell their great-grandchildren about them?" Sarah asked. Thomas smiled. "I will tell them the truth, that love can come when you least expect it, that sometimes the worst days lead to the best years. That my father found my mother drenched from a storm, carried her inside by the fire and fell in love with her. And that love lasted a lifetime and beyond." He looked up at the hill one more time, at the 3 graves silhouetted against the sunset, and he could almost see them there. His mother's uncle welcoming them, his parents finally reunited, all of them watching over the ranch and the family that continued to grow and thrive. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise that their story would not be forgotten, that it would be told and retold, a testament to the power of love and the beautiful things that can grow from the smallest acts of kindness. The ranch would endure, the family would continue, and somewhere in the vast Wyoming sky, two souls who had found each other in a storm were finally, peacefully, eternally together. Thomas turned back to the house, to his own family waiting inside, to the legacy his parents had left him. He would honor them by living fully, by loving deeply, by building on what they had started. The story that had begun on a stormy night in 1878 would continue through him and his children and his children's children, proof that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world are not storms or violence or hardship, but simple human kindness and the love that grows from it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas whispered, "Thank you, Father, for showing me what it means to be a good man. Thank you, Mother, for teaching me about strength and grace. Rest well. Your work here is done, and it was done beautifully." Inside the house, his daughter called for him, and Thomas smiled. Life went on, as it always did, carrying forward the lessons and the love of those who came before. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, 3 graves stood watch in the gathering darkness. 3 souls at peace, their stories complete, their love eternal. The ranch lights flickered on one by one, warm and welcoming against the night, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, not threatening but gentle, like a reminder of where it all began. Like a promise that every storm, no matter how fierce, eventually passes, and what remains can be beautiful beyond measure if we have the courage to open our hearts and carry each other to safety.